Foundational to our understanding of childhood trauma is an understanding of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. This research was done in the late 1990s, and it was the first time that researchers ever really looked at the impact of adverse experience on childhood, teenage, and adult health. The original researchers, Dr. Rob Anda and Dr. Vince Felitti, for the first time asked questions related to household issues. For example, uh, abuse, three types of abuse: neglect, household dysfunction, things like substance use in the home or mental illness in the home. They were working with a population of largely middle class, uh, college educated, over 17,000 people, the largest study of this type ever done. And what they found was pretty surprising to them. What they found is that these experiences were actually very prevalent in this population. Over 25% had substance abuse in the home, over 25% reported experiencing physical abuse, but even things like sexual abuse, more than 20%, or parental violence or mental illness. What they then asked is, were there multiple types of these adverse experiences that individuals experience? And they looked to add them up. And this chart shows what happens when they looked at that analysis. So the tan bars on this chart are the Kaiser study, again, originally a middle class, college educated population. And they found about a third of that population really had none of these, but as little more than 10% had four or more. Since that time, this research has been replicated with a number of other populations, which we might call high risk. So the blue bars on this slide are from a study of juvenile offenders in Florida. And you'll see here that population, almost none of them experienced no ACEs, and over 50% had four or more, which means that the kids who had experienced the most adversity and presumably had acted out, our response was to punish them. So the question is, what is that impact of four or more ACEs, and how do we understand that? Two of the areas that have the biggest impact from multiple ACEs are substance use and suicide. So these charts illustrate that. On the left-hand side, you'll see that the impact of multiple ACEs, four or more ACEs, individuals are 10 times more likely to have used IV drug use. The suicidality is interesting. If no ACEs, about 1 in 100 people may have attempted suicide, but with 7 or more ACEs, nearly 20% of those individuals attempt suicide at some point in their lives. So the impact is huge. Researchers have started to ask why this might be, and have started to understand ACEs really as a root cause. We basically observe some of the things at the top of this pyramid, like the risky behaviors or overt disease. But underlying that are adverse experiences and even multi-generational impacts, where the impact of ACEs can be conveyed across generations. And not only does it have social and emotional impact, but we know that there's actual physiological and neurological impact. These illustrations from a series of studies by Dr. Bruce Perry showed, now this is an extreme example, but extreme neglect, the actual brain size and neurological connections had shrunk. They were actually smaller. So there was a physical impact of the neglect that had been experienced. So what all of this leads us to ask then is, so what is the impact of ACEs? And looking at this, researchers have identified what they call the population attributable risk. Now, this is a kind of tricky concept, and it's important to understand because ACEs are predictive on a population basis, but not on an individual basis. So when I was looking at this, I said, well, I've got a pretty high ACE score, boom, boom, boom. Does that mean I'm doomed? Well, not at all. I like to use the example of tobacco. A lot of people that smoke will develop lung cancer, but not everybody that smokes will develop lung cancer, and not everybody who gets lung cancer was a smoker. There's going to be a certain percentage. And what this chart illustrates is the percentage of impact of adverse experiences. So if we look lower left here, the impact on IV drug use is huge. 78% of the difference in IV drug use can be accounted for by differential ACE scores. And the same around the circle. Many of these things that we expect, suicidality, we've talked about, mental illness, but even things like missing work or drinking and driving, even diabetes and ischemic heart disease, all can be impacted by these early experiences. Now, the important part about this chart, one of the people we've worked with, Laura Porter, calls this the oil slick chart. And it's oil slick because it looks like that, but it's also a great analogy. If you turn this disc flat, and this were real oil, if you push really hard in one section of the oil, like IV drug use, what happens? The oil's just going to go somewhere else. What we want to do is drain a hole in the middle and drain the oil so that we impact all of those areas. And this is the fundamental concept of being trauma responsive. We address the fundamental issues, the underlying causes with adverse childhood experiences, which then address all of these other issues. And research since the time of Rob Anda and Vince Folletti have shown that there are other sources of adversity. They looked at household dysfunction, but we know that the community sources can provide sources of dysfunction, bullying, racism, sexism, gender issues. The environment can create adverse experiences. So all of these sources can generate issues for child development, teenage health, adult health. And the fundamental concept of trauma responsive care is understanding the impact of adversity and doing what we can up front to reduce those as predeterminants or social determinants of the long-term health risk.